Okay, so we're finally here, the last episode. And honestly, this one's going to hit differently because we're talking about something deeply personal. What happens to who you are when the cultural markers that ground you start to evaporate? This is the last episode of Digital Convergence, solo audio podcast. First, let me tell you about Liam. You'll recognize this story, it's everywhere now. So 2025, Liam's third generation, grew up nowhere near the homeland, and he's got this moment where he's like, I want to understand where I came from. Very earnest. He turns to AI, asks about his family's traditions, and the AI gives him these beautiful, clean answers. Well-formatted, coherent, informative. He feels like he's finally getting it. Then he brings it up with his grandmother. And there's this pause, right? She's trying to be kind, but you can see it in her face. That's not quite wrong, she says, but it's not quite right either. Because here's the thing, the AI got the facts, sure, but it completely missed the texture. The contradictions, the regional variations, the parts of the tradition that people actually argue about because it's alive, not museum preserved. It gave him a logo without the story. And then Liam realizes the system wasn't trained on his family's lived experience. It was trained on whoever wrote the most about this stuff in English. Whoever got indexed and weighted most heavily. Which isn't the AI's fault, exactly, it's doing what it was designed to do. But it raises this crucial question. When AI becomes your primary interface for understanding culture, including your own, whose version are you actually learning? Before we go further, let me define something we'll use throughout: cultural alignment. Basically, how well AI outputs match local values, norms, and ways of knowing. Whether the system understands what appropriate, or successful, or meaningful looks like in your specific context. There's recent research from PNAS Nexus showing that frontier AI models, the most advanced ones, default toward Western self-expression values. Specifically Protestant European frameworks, unless you explicitly countersteer them. The system gives you an answer, but whose cultural logic shaped it, whose assumptions are baked in. And this matters because AI isn't just answering questions anymore. It's shaping how we express ourselves, how we learn about heritage, how we present work, even how we understand what quality or success means. Cultural expression anchors identity. But when the defaults converge, when the path of least resistance always leads to the same globally optimized templates, communities lose the distinct markers that carry memory and meaning. And look, the risk isn't change itself. Culture has always evolved through exchange. The risk is thinning variety across contexts that need difference to thrive. Today we're focusing on the human cost. How do fading cultural markers weaken identity, belonging, social cohesion in everyday life? What happens psychologically when your authentic expression keeps getting labeled, low-performing, or niche by algorithmic systems? And here's the twist. Why does AI's own future capacity depend on preserving the very cultural diversity it threatens to erase? We've built toward this across 5 episodes. We've seen how recommenders reduce interuser diversity by herding everyone toward the same popular stuff. We've looked at how Western-skewed defaults, 89 to 92% English in major training corpora, which is wild, shape what counts as successful culture. We've traced the feedback loop where homogenized outputs become tomorrow's training inputs. Now we're bringing it home to what this means for identity, belonging, the cultural anchors that help us know who we are. All right, let's break down the mechanisms. How does this actually happen in daily life? First, algorithmic herding. Episode 1, remember? That WWW 2024 research showing modern recommenders create this weird paradox. They seem to break filter bubbles, you feel like you're exploring more variety individually. But simultaneously, they're reducing interuser diversity, herding everyone toward the same clusters of popular content. We're all exploring, but we're all exploring the same carefully curated territory. Second, Western defaults. The numbers are absurd. LLMA2's training corpus? Approximately 89.7% English. GPT-3 estimates hit 92.65% English. And this isn't just about language, it's about whose cultural logic becomes the default for billions of users worldwide. When models train overwhelmingly on English content, reflecting Western value frameworks. They naturally produce outputs that feel right to Western users, but alien or oversimplified to everyone else. Third, economic pressure. Platform capitalism optimizes for engagement and scale. It favors virality-aligned formats over local meaning. Episode 2 covered this. Visibility depends on fitting dominant patterns. Cultural works get financialized as content, resorted by conversion metrics instead of community significance. What doesn't scale gets marked niche. What scales reshapes local expectations. Fourth, feedback amplification. Here's where it gets properly recursive. Homogenized outputs become tomorrow's training inputs. Each generation of models trained on prior outputs risks compounding aesthetic drift and conceptual narrowing. Like an endless game of telephone, meaning flattens as distribution tightens around median styles. These four mechanisms work together, accelerating convergence while making it feel natural, even inevitable. Now let's make this concrete. What does cultural flattening actually look like? Traditional festivals around the world increasingly adopt the same visual language optimized for social media shareability. Bright colors, specific compositional rules, easily digestible formats. Local symbolism gets diluted into global tropes because that's what algorithms surface and reward. And festival organizers aren't stupid. They know what they're losing. But they also know visibility matters for attendance, tourism, economic survival. In architecture and design, tools trained on global templates produce forms that look cutting-edge in renderings, but diverge from local function and cultural memory. They ignore regional climate patterns, locally available materials, vernacular building wisdom accumulated over generations. The buildings photograph beautifully. They trend on design platforms, but they don't belong to place the way traditional architecture did. For language, the barriers are immediate and quantifiable. A creator working in Tamil, Swahili, or Bahasa Indonesia sees far lower reach than English-language peers. Even when translating, nuance erodes because model stylistic priors nudge toward globally legible phrasing. Visibility improves only after heavy prompt scaffolding and local review, raising the cost of authenticity. This creates a two-tiered system. Those whose cultural context aligns with model defaults get efficient assistance. Everyone else has to constantly fight the system to maintain their voice. Heritage transmission is particularly vulnerable. Young people learn about their cultural traditions through AI-generated summaries that capture surface facts, but miss the contested meanings, regional variations, contradictions that make traditions alive. What they receive is recognizable but thinner, like a logo without a story. Commercial spaces reveal the pressure most visibly. Episode 2, when cafes from Tokyo to Toronto converge on the same aesthetics and playlists mirroring social feed trends, it's not because local owners love the sameness. They adopt the template for survival. Customers arrive primed by platform taste. Deviation risks poor reviews, lower foot traffic, economic failure. Identity coherence weakens when platforms privilege portable signals over situated practices. The cultural markers that help communities maintain distinct identities, specific storytelling patterns, aesthetic traditions, problem-solving approaches, get smoothed away in favor of templates optimized for cross-cultural scalability. Let's focus specifically on language, because this is where the mechanisms become most visible and measurable. When you create content in a minority language, even a major minority language like Bengali with 230 million speakers, you face immediate algorithmic disadvantages. Lower reach, lower engagement, lower monetization potential. The system wasn't optimized for you. But it's not just about being in a minority language. It's about cultural problem framing. The way you naturally structure a narrative, the metaphors that feel intuitive, the examples that carry weight in your community, these might not align with what the model was trained to recognize as good writing or compelling content. So you adapt, you learn to prompt differently, you add extensive context, you review outputs carefully and correct them toward your authentic voice. You can make it work, but it costs time, energy, cognitive load. Every interaction requires you to bridge a gap that shouldn't exist. This creates what I'm calling a two-tiered system. If your cultural context happens to align with model defaults, you get efficient, helpful assistance. The AI feels like a genuine partner. But if you're misaligned, every interaction is a negotiation. You're not just creating, you're constantly translating, correcting, fighting the defaults. And here's the psychological impact. When algorithms consistently label your culturally authentic content as low-performing, when they require extensive workarounds to reflect your actual voice, they send a powerful implicit message. Your way of expressing yourself is not valuable in this system. Now let's talk about what this does to people, both as individuals and as members of communities. Cultural plurality supports belonging by reflecting many ways to be and to know. This isn't just philosophical, it's fundamental to psychological health. When you can't see yourself reflected authentically in the cultural landscape around you, it creates what researchers call a self-recognition crisis. The world feels like it's designed for someone else. Your way of being feels like an exception rather than one valid path among many. Research on creative precarity, particularly recent work from 2020-2025, reveals how platform metrics and AI pipelines reshape cultural workers' identities at a deep level. Episode 1 covered this. Creators experience shifting roles, weakened control over their work, profound authenticity anxieties as they adapt to algorithmic preferences. This isn't just career stress. It's about how the tools meant to assist creation subtly standardize format, voice, even self-perception. When your livelihood depends on algorithmic performance, and the algorithm consistently rewards certain modes of expression while penalizing others, you internalize those preferences. Your sense of what good work means begins to shift. Your authentic voice starts to feel like a liability. This can foster what I'm calling cultural shame, a sense that your way of expressing yourself, the cultural practices you inherited, the aesthetic sensibilities you grew up with, are somehow deficient or unmarketable. Not explicitly, of course. The system doesn't tell you this directly, but it shows you, through metrics, through reach, through which content gets surfaced and which gets buried. For minority languages and cultural traditions already under pressure, this algorithmic marginalization adds another layer of erosion. Young people see that content in their heritage language performs poorly, that traditional aesthetics don't trend, that authentic cultural expression requires constant explanation and context. The path of least resistance is to switch to the globally legible default. And honestly, who can blame them? The effects ripple beyond individuals to reshape entire communities and the transmission of culture across generations. Think about how heritage transmission traditionally worked. Elders possessed layered, contextual knowledge, not just facts, but the contradictions, regional variations, contested meanings, stories behind the stories. Learning culture meant absorbing this complexity through participation, observation, conversation. But now, increasingly, young people learn heritage via AI-generated summaries. And here's the thing, those summaries aren't wrong exactly. They capture real information, but they lack texture. They present culture as settled fact rather than living practice. They smooth away the contradictions that make traditions adaptive and resilient. What remains is recognizable but thinner, like a logo without a story. The younger generation learns a version of their culture that their elders don't quite recognize, and this creates this peculiar form of intergenerational conflict. The young person says, "This is how culture works now. This is how it needs to be presented to be viable in the modern world." And they're not wrong, they're responding rationally to the economic and algorithmic pressures they face. The elder says, "But you're missing what made it meaningful. The version you're presenting is correct but bloodless." And they're not wrong either, they can feel the loss of complexity, nuance, situated meaning. Both are right. Both are responding rationally to their contexts. But the gap between them represents a fracture in cultural continuity that compounds with each generation. Community cohesion weakens when shared, specific cultural markers erode. The common reference points that helped a community feel like a we, particular aesthetic sensibilities, storytelling patterns, problem-solving approaches, even the specific texture of humor, get replaced by generic templates that work across contexts but belong to none. And here's what's insidious. Tacit knowledge disappears first. The practices that can't be easily documented, that rely on embodied understanding, that require years of immersion, these fade while we're busy preserving the easily digitized fragments. We save the words but lose the music. We capture the recipe but forget why it mattered when your grandmother made it. Let me share some composite testimony, patterns that emerge across different cultural contexts when people talk about this experience. I speak my heritage language, but when I use AI tools in that language, the responses feel off, like they're translating from English assumptions rather than thinking in my language. My traditional aesthetic sensibilities get zero engagement on social platforms unless I modernize them, which really means making them look like the globalized template. The AI can tell me facts about my culture that are technically accurate, but they feel hollow. It's like the difference between reading about love and feeling it. I'm teaching my kids a Wikipedia version of what I actually lived. The complexity I experienced has been flattened into bullet points. I joined online communities for shared cultural identity, but increasingly what we share is just the same algorithmic feed with cultural branding. The common thread, authentic expression, requires fighting the systems that should be assisting it. This is the belonging crisis. When your authentic self requires constant translation, constant workarounds, constant justification to pass through algorithmic gates, something fundamental is breaking. And here's the paradox. We have more access to cultural information than ever before. You can learn about any tradition, any practice, any art form with a few searches. But culture feels thinner, because information isn't culture. Culture is the lived practice, the embodied knowledge, the situated meaning that makes information matter. When AI becomes the primary mediator of cultural knowledge, and that AI was trained primarily on one dominant cultural perspective, we don't lose access to information about other cultures. We lose access to those cultures as ways of being and knowing, as frameworks for understanding the world, as alternatives to the default. Now here's where this story takes an unexpected turn. Because preserving cultural diversity isn't just about heritage or equity or identity, though those are crucial. It's also about AI's own technical future. This is what Episode 5 called the learning limitation paradox, and it's worth understanding clearly. AI learns from human cultural production. If that production narrows, models inherit and amplify those constraints, reducing their future capacity. Let me spell out the feedback loop. Human cultural diversity creates varied training data. AI trains on that data and gains broad capability. But then AI systems, through recommenders and templates and economic incentives, push cultural production toward convergence. That converged production becomes tomorrow's training data. Models trained on narrower inputs have reduced capacity to serve diverse contexts. Their limitations further accelerate convergence, and the loop tightens. This isn't hypothetical. We're already seeing it. Each generation of models trained significantly on prior model outputs shows signs of what researchers call model collapse. Degradation in quality, creativity, ability to represent edge cases. Like a photocopy of a photocopy, fidelity degrades with each iteration. From a technical perspective, cultural diversity expands the hypothesis space AI can explore. Different cultures have developed different solutions to universal human problems. Different architectural approaches to climate, different social structures for cooperation, different artistic traditions for expressing emotion, different problem-solving frameworks for understanding causality. Each distinct cultural tradition represents a different solution path, a different set of heuristics and assumptions, a different way of carving up the problem space. When AI trains on genuinely diverse cultural production, it learns a wider range of strategies. It becomes more flexible, more adaptable, more useful across contexts. But when training data converges around dominant templates, the model essentially learns the same solution patterns repeatedly. Its capability becomes optimized for the majority case, but brittle for everything else. And everything else is most of humanity. Let's extend this further. Cultural diversity isn't just about preserving the past, it's an innovation engine for the future. Throughout human history, breakthroughs often came from the intersection of different cultural traditions. Different ways of thinking about problems, different assumptions about what's possible, different aesthetic sensibilities that opened new directions. Cross-pollination of ideas across cultures has driven innovation in science, art, technology, social organization. But AI-driven homogenization threatens to close off those alternative paths before we even know what they might have offered. When we optimize toward a single template of successful culture, we're essentially running a massive global experiment with one hypothesis: that the dominant cultural logic of 2025 represents the best solution to human creative and intellectual challenges. That seems unlikely. More probably, we're optimizing for local maxima, what works well in current Western-dominated digital capitalism, while foreclosing exploration of other peaks in the solution space that might be higher but require different paths to reach. There's a historical parallel here worth noting. Agricultural monoculture produces impressive yields in good conditions, but creates vulnerability to single points of failure. One pest, one disease, one environmental shift can devastate an entire crop because there's no diversity to provide resilience. Cultural monoculture creates similar vulnerabilities. When institutions converge on similarly aligned models and metrics, Episode 4, they share blind spots. Problems that the dominant framework can't see or solve will remain invisible until they become crises. Diversity provides resilience, not just for culture itself, but for our collective ability to solve problems and adapt to challenges. The paradox exists as a technical dynamic regardless of whether any particular actor chooses to respond to it. AI depends on human creativity and diversity. But current AI systems, through their structural incentives and defaults, systematically thin that diversity. In the long run, this undermines the very foundation AI needs to remain useful and innovative. So what can be done? Various approaches to addressing these dynamics are being explored by different actors across technical, policy, and social domains. On the technical side, plural data strategies are emerging. Some research initiatives and organizations are working to expand training corpora beyond English-dominant sources, more languages, cultural contexts, ways of knowing. The outcomes are uncertain. It's difficult work with complex trade-offs, but the recognition that current data imbalances create problems is growing. Cultural alignment research demonstrates that model outputs can vary dramatically by country and context. The PNAS Nexus work we've referenced shows this variation exists and can be influenced through data choices and prompting strategies. This means technical possibilities exist for more locally attuned systems, though realizing those possibilities at scale requires intentional effort and genuine consultation with local communities. Some discussions center on regional models, AI systems built specifically for particular cultural contexts rather than one-size-fits-all global models. These would have higher development costs, but potentially much better cultural fit. Whether this approach proves sustainable and how it might scale remain open questions. On the policy and governance side, frameworks like the ASEAN Guide on AI Governance and Ethics propose context-sensitive oversight rather than universal metrics. These recognize that what counts as appropriate, beneficial, or harmful varies across cultural contexts and should be determined locally rather than imposed globally. There's growing discussion of cultural audits, systematic monitoring of how AI systems represent different cultures, which communities are underserved, how outputs drift over time. Some jurisdictions are exploring whether cultural preservation should be explicitly mandated in AI development, similar to how environmental impact is assessed. Community participation frameworks aim to involve cultural stakeholders earlier in the development process, not just as users, but as co-designers who help shape how systems work in their contexts. On the economic and social side, interventions focus on reducing the penalty for cultural specificity. This includes platform design changes that don't systematically punish non-dominant content, support structures for creators maintaining authentic voices, education about algorithmic dynamics so communities can make informed choices about how to navigate these systems. But what about agency? What can individuals, communities, institutions actually do within these structural constraints? For individuals, recognition itself matters. Understanding that algorithmic suggestions are optimizations based on dominant patterns, not neutral truths about quality or value, changes how you interpret them. You can use AI tools as starting points while actively seeking culturally specific sources. You can question when outputs feel generic or misaligned. You can treat AI-generated cultural knowledge as one input among many rather than the authoritative version. Sharing knowledge of workarounds and strategies within communities helps collectively navigate systems that weren't designed for you. Every time someone figures out how to prompt a model to better reflect their cultural context, that knowledge can be passed on. For communities, documentation becomes crucial. Recording cultural knowledge in diverse formats and languages, creating archives that aren't solely dependent on dominant platforms, organizing collective discussions about which cultural elements are negotiable and which are core. These actions build resilience. Collective action around platform design and governance matters too. Individual creators have little leverage, but organized communities can advocate for changes, demand accountability, create alternative spaces when dominant platforms prove unworkable. Supporting cultural workers who maintain authentic practices despite economic pressure is an act of cultural preservation. So is educating younger generations not just about culture, but about the systems shaping how culture is transmitted and validated. For institutions, whether platforms, governments, educational organizations, research labs, choices exist at every level. Investment priorities, building culturally diverse training data versus quick scaling. Design decisions, penalizing cultural specificity versus accommodating it. Governance structures, who gets consulted in development, whose definitions of success matter, how impacts are assessed. None of these actions solve the problem alone. The structural dynamics are powerful, but recognition of the dynamics enables more intentional choices, and collective intentionality across many actors can shift trajectories. So we arrive at an open question: what kind of future are we building? Two trajectories are possible, and many variations between them. Path 1 is continued convergence. Cultural production narrows further toward globally legible templates. Local markers become increasingly niche and economically precarious. Identity coherence weakens as fewer authentic reflections exist in the cultural landscape. AI capability narrows as training data loses diversity. Innovation becomes constrained by shared assumptions and blind spots. This isn't a conspiracy or anyone's explicit goal. It's just the outcome of current structural incentives playing out at scale. Path 2 is designed plurality. Systems are explicitly built to accommodate cultural diversity. Economic models don't systematically penalize cultural specificity. Communities maintain meaningful agency over cultural transmission. Training data remains rich and varied. Multiple ways of being and knowing remain viable. This doesn't happen automatically. It requires intentional choices at every level, from model architecture to platform design to governance frameworks. The determining factors aren't inevitable technological or economic forces. They're choices being made right now across many contexts. By developers deciding what to optimize for, by policymakers choosing what to regulate and how, by platform designers deciding whose needs to prioritize, by communities organizing around cultural preservation, by individuals deciding what to accept and what to resist. The infrastructure is not yet set in stone. The choices being made now about data collection, model training, platform design, governance frameworks, economic incentives will shape whether AI becomes a force for cultural homogenization or enables sustainable pluralism. But this podcast doesn't prescribe which path to take. My goal is to make the dynamics visible so that whatever choices are made, they're made with awareness of what's at stake. Over these 6 episodes, we've traced a complete loop, from individual creative decisions to global cultural patterns and back to personal identity. Episodes 1 and 2 showed us the mechanisms, how AI recommenders reduce interuser diversity by herding everyone toward modal genres, even while appearing to offer more choice. How Western-skewed defaults embedded in training data, 89 to 92% English, create economic pressure toward globally legible templates. How spaces from cafes to festivals converge on platform-optimized aesthetics not from love, but from survival logic. Episode 3 revealed the feedback loop. Homogenized outputs become tomorrow's training inputs, creating this vicious cycle where recommenders drive convergence, models learn from that narrower data, and each generation is trained on thinner cultural signals. Like a photocopy of a photocopy, fidelity degrades with each iteration. Episode 4 examined what this means for innovation. When institutions converge on similarly aligned models and metrics, solution search space contracts around shared priors. Cultural diversity serves as an innovation engine by widening hypothesis space, but homogenization quietly disincentivizes variation and creates shared blind spots. Episode 5 explored the paradox. AI depends on human cultural diversity for its own learning and capability, yet AI systems threaten to erode that diversity through structural incentives. Less diverse production today means narrower training signals tomorrow, which means less capable models the day after. The feedback loop operates regardless of whether anyone intends it or responds to it. And today, Episode 6 brought it home to identity and belonging. When cultural markers fade, communities lose the anchors that help maintain distinct ways of being and knowing. The psychological toll is real: self-recognition crises, cultural shame, authenticity anxieties, belonging crises. But recognizing these dynamics enables agency. Awareness creates space for more intentional choices at individual, community, and institutional levels. The core insight running through all 6 episodes: scale doesn't inherently have to erase difference, but current structural incentives, algorithmic optimization for engagement, economic pressure for global legibility, training data feedback loops, push strongly in that direction. The question is whether we collectively choose to design differently. Let me return to where we started, with Liam learning about his cultural heritage. In the original telling, Liam accepts the AI's answers until his grandmother corrects him. He feels confused and slightly betrayed. The system gave him coherent information that turned out to be incomplete or oversimplified. But imagine Liam with awareness of the dynamics we've explored. He still uses AI. It's a useful starting point, efficient for initial exploration. But now he questions the outputs. When answers feel too clean, too simple, too generic, he recognizes those as signals that he's getting the globally legible version rather than the culturally specific one. He understands his grandmother's gentle corrections not as contradictions, but as cultural alignment gaps. The difference between what a Western-dominant training corpus captured and what his specific family and community actually practiced. He uses AI as one tool alongside others: elder conversations, community gatherings, culturally specific texts, embodied participation in practices. Not as sole authority, but as efficient entry point that needs supplementation and verification. And when he eventually teaches his own children about their heritage, he'll say, "This is one version of our culture, filtered through certain defaults and assumptions. Let me also tell you what it felt like to actually live it, what your great-grandmother would say about it, and why the AI version is recognizable but missing something crucial." The difference awareness makes: not passive acceptance of algorithmic outputs as truth, but active navigation with understanding of system limitations. The infrastructure shapes options, but awareness shapes choices within constraints. Take a moment to reflect on your own experience through the lens of what we've explored. Personal reflection: which aspects of your culture, however you define that, feel authentically represented in AI systems and digital platforms? Where do you notice oversimplification, genericization, misalignment between what you know and what systems present? When you use AI tools, whose cultural logic do you sense shaping the outputs? Can you feel the Western defaults, the English language assumptions, the particular value frameworks embedded in responses? What would be lost if the local, specific markers that distinguish your culture continued fading toward global templates? How do you currently navigate between algorithmic suggestions and authentic expression? Do you find yourself adapting to fit platform expectations, or fighting to maintain your voice, or some complex mixture of both? Community reflection. How is your community's culture, whether geographic, ethnic, professional, or chosen, being represented in digital spaces? What knowledge is being lost because it doesn't fit easily into algorithmic formats? The tacit, the contextual, the embodied, the contested. Who actually decides which cultural elements to preserve and which to let evolve or fade? Are those decisions being made consciously by communities or implicitly by algorithmic optimization pressures? What would resistance to homogenization look like in your specific context? Structural reflection. Which institutions most shape cultural norms in your life? Platforms, schools, media organizations, professional networks. How do the economic incentives in those institutions affect what cultural expressions they reward or penalize? Where do you see feedback loops that narrow cultural variety? Where do you see forces that might expand it? What would culturally plural infrastructure actually look like in your domain, the specific contexts where you live, work, and create? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're invitations to notice the dynamics in your own landscape. Because the patterns we've explored, algorithmic herding, Western defaults, feedback amplification, identity erosion, operate whether we notice them or not. But noticing changes what becomes possible. So where do we go from here? The honest answer is, we don't know yet. The outcomes remain genuinely uncertain. Will plural data initiatives gain traction and prove effective? Or will they remain niche efforts overwhelmed by the scale of English-dominant corpora? Can economic models evolve beyond systematically penalizing cultural specificity? Or will optimization for global reach continue dominating? Will communities maintain meaningful agency over cultural transmission? Or will algorithmic mediation increasingly define what counts as authentic? How will next-generation models handle diversity challenges? Will they improve cultural alignment or entrench existing imbalances? Which governance frameworks will emerge as viable and which will prove effective? These questions don't have predetermined answers. They'll be determined by choices made across many levels and contexts. Platform designers deciding what to optimize for, researchers choosing what problems to investigate and how, policymakers setting rules and incentives, communities organizing for cultural agency, individuals navigating systems with awareness of how they work. No single actor controls the trajectory, but collective patterns of choice shape outcomes, and those patterns are not yet locked in. The infrastructure we're building now, the AI systems, the platforms, the economic models, the governance frameworks, will shape cultural possibilities for decades. But it's still being built. Choices made in the next few years will matter enormously. From sameness to plurality, the trajectory is not yet determined. This has been Digital Convergence. Let me close by clarifying what this series aimed to do and what it deliberately didn't. What we aimed to do: make invisible dynamics visible. Trace the mechanisms by which individual choices aggregate into systemic patterns. Connect technical details about training data and algorithmic optimization to human consequences for identity, belonging, cultural continuity. Recognize structural pressures without claiming determinism. Enable more intentional navigation and choice. What we didn't prescribe: which specific cultural elements should be preserved versus allowed to evolve. That's for communities to decide in their own contexts. Whether scale and diversity can genuinely coexist in AI systems, that remains an open empirical question. Specific policy solutions, those are context-dependent and require local knowledge and negotiation. Individual choices about adaptation versus resistance, those depend on circumstances, values, constraints that vary widely. The underlying conviction of this entire series: recognition of dynamics creates space for agency. When you understand how algorithmic herding works, you can navigate recommendations differently. When you recognize Western defaults, you can consciously countersteer. When you see feedback loops, you can choose what to feed into them. When you understand the identity costs of homogenization, you can make more informed choices about when to conform and when to resist. Awareness doesn't eliminate structural constraints. The economic pressures are real. The algorithmic incentives are powerful. The feedback loops operate at scale, but awareness does enable more intentional choices, individually, communally, institutionally. And collective patterns of intentional choices can shift trajectories. Not easily, not quickly, but genuinely. The future of cultural identity in an AI-driven world is not yet written. The conversation doesn't end here. It continues in every interaction where algorithmic systems meet human culture. In every recommendation algorithm you navigate, every AI tool you use, every platform you engage with, every cultural choice you make under these new constraints. Thank you for sticking with me through this journey. May the recognition of these dynamics help you navigate them with greater intention. This has been Digital Convergence. Until next time,